was to try and find a chemotherapy-free regime and where we could identify which patients would get a good long-term survival without giving the usual chemotherapy and antibody therapy to patients. And we did that by using PET scans to identify early responders. Well, we hope that the purpose of the study would be if we could find that chemotherapy-free regime that avoided the toxic effects of chemotherapy in the short and the long term to patients, but keep long-term survival, which we know can be excellent with patients now. We thought that would be a good idea because no patients want chemotherapy and we don't want to give chemotherapy. It was very original design in the PHERGain study because it was using PET scans as a way early on at identifying which patients you would think were going to go on to get a complete response, which we know leads to good survival, versus giving all the therapy up front and then going, well, these patients will do well, or, oh dear, we've given all this treatment and they won't. So using a PET scan along with other parameters to identify patients early in the course of therapy as to whether you think you'd be able to avoid chemotherapy or you needed to add it in was very novel. We prefer chemotherapy approach, and patients much prefer chemotherapy approach because most of the side effects of regimes with antibodies such as trastuzumab and pertuzumab are down to the chemotherapy. So all the sickness and hair loss and risk of neutropenia and sepsis, as well as the tiredness and the trauma of cancer treatment, most of it is due to the chemotherapy. So if we can find patients that we can hopefully cure without chemotherapy, then that would be a much preferable regime and only give the chemotherapy to the people who most needed it. Well, the results of the PHERGain study were looking at patients who didn't have chemotherapy, but just started with the antibodies of trastuzumab and pertuzumab. If they had a response on the PET scan after 2 cycles, then they just carried on with the Herceptin and pertuzumab to surgery. And about 80% of people were deemed to be responding well, and quite a large proportion of those patients did have a complete response at surgery with antibodies alone. And then those patients went on at 3 years to have an incredibly good relapse-free survival with only 1 patient in the whole cohort relapsing. So, using PET scans seems to be a way of safely avoiding chemotherapy. The results are very relevant to patients because if you've got availability to PET scans, and you can do that in patients before and after 2 cycles of chemotherapy, then that will give you a treatment option to try and have a chemotherapy-free regime with all the toxicity that avoids in these patients. But without the PET scans, we've got no way of knowing which patients or predicting accurately which patients you need to give chemotherapy or not. So the temptation is to give chemotherapy to everybody rather than this selective and PET-driven response adapted therapy, which would be much less toxic for patients and much less resource on the healthcare systems. Well, the next steps are to further look at the results and see whether the MRI scans that were done correlate with clinical response, correlate with some of the biomarkers we did. And if we could come up with a sort of algorithm of if they have a good response on the PET scan and the biomarkers help and the MRI clinical examinations help, if we could be more certain that you could avoid chemotherapy in patients with that algorithm, or that you didn't leave out chemotherapy where it may be needed, then I think it's very exciting to join together all the tests that we did in the study to come up with an algorithm to avoid chemotherapy in more patients where appropriate. I think this is obviously just looking at one chemotherapy regime and one antibody regime, but obviously the next step, if this is shown on further analysis to be useful, is to use this in more regimes, and rather than just giving every single drug to every single patient, with whatever therapy it is, if you can add other therapies in, if they're not responding properly after 2 cycles, then it would be nice to use PET scans and biomarkers to safely de-escalate or appropriately escalate therapy in patients rather than just giving every single drug to every single patient.